This is the beginning of Chapter 21, Republican Progressives in Power. Now, I'm going to have to split this up into a 21A and a 21B because Chapter 21 is one of the longest chapters we cover in this textbook through this course. So this is Chapter 21A's narrated PowerPoint. In the 19 teens, the Republican progressives were definitely dominant in California's governance. Um, Members of the Lincoln Roosevelt Republican movement in the 1910 California elections gained control of state government, both houses and the governorship, and they set out to establish a new order of politics in California. As a result of the first legislative session in the beginning of 1911, the legislature established the holding of a special election that October. In that election, the progressives had 23 measures on the ballot that required constitutional amendments. All but one of them passed, which was quite extraordinary. The reforms were remarkable, but Rawls and Bean point out that this was at least partly because no other major state was more critically in need of reform than California at the time because of all the chaos of the latter part of the 19th century. Um, a measure was passed to give the Railroad Commission full and effective power with respect to regulating shipping rates. It was passed unanimously by both the Assembly and the Senate. So you can really see there was a hunger to reform the oppressive nature of the railroads and their stranglehold control over California politics prior to this time, ending the decades long grip of power over the railroads and of the railroads in California governance. The same commission that was established to govern the railroads was also given power by the legislature to regulate the rates charged by all other public utilities, meaning, water, electric, that sort of thing, except the ones that were municipally owned. This was also passed by unanimous vote of both houses. This is quite extraordinary, really, quite a watershed. The State Board of Control was also created. This was set up to establish budget procedures and to inventory state property. These two elements of California governance had been chaotic heretofore. Tax and banking reform was also passed at this time in the realm of regulation, efficiency, and finance. With respect to political reform itself, there was a constitutional amendment adopting two methods of direct participation by the voters in their own governance. The initiative enabled voters to enact laws or constitutional amendments that had presumably been blocked by legislators, and the referendum gave voters the power to veto acts of the legislature. These are two very, very powerful things that exist today, 100 years later, in California governance, which not all states have. Initiatives required signatures of 8% of the voters. Referendum required 5% signatures of the voters. Now, some progressives warned that a fixed number of signatures would have been better because as the population increased, perhaps only special interests would then be able to reach those thresholds with respect to getting either an initiative or referendum on the ballot. Those warnings by the progressives were unheeded. So, in some respects, we have what we have today, where oftentimes it's special interests that get their initiative or referendum on the ballot, regardless of the amount of signatures, or only those special interests are able to get those numbers of signatures because maybe they can hire signature, gatherers, the ones you see in front of the grocery stores now. So this is a very important thing that the progressives tried to bring up at the time, but those warnings were ignored. Also, a measure providing for public recall of elected officials was approved, but it was more hotly contested than the one for the initiative and the referendum. This is because Governor Hiram Johnson insisted that the recall measure also include the power of voters to recall judges, which has been done from time to time. Back in the 70s and early 80s, there was a move to recall one of Governor Jerry Brown's judges at the time, Justice Rose Bird, who was recalled. The party column and party circle were eliminated from the ballot. This then discouraged people from voting a straight party ticket rather than picking and choosing from all the candidates. Certain local and municipal elections were made to be nonpartisan. This was based on a new charter for the city of Berkeley that the legislature approved in 1909 for that city alone. But then it got expanded to apply to statewide judges and school officials in 1911 and to county officials like county boards of supervisors in 1913. So this is quite sweeping as well. Uh, Something that was quite peculiar in California during this reform movement, maybe a step too far, some say, was the cross filing system that was adopted in 1913. This allowed a candidate to be the nominee of more than one political party. Now, this obviously had complications. Um, while arguing that it was good for the general welfare of the state, the Johnson progressives also used it for their own purposes. So there was an ulterior motive here. This allowed Republicans, for instance, to cross-file with the new Progressive Party in California, so they would not lose their Republican identity when the Bull Moose Party or National Progressives split off from the Republicans. So they kind of wanted their cake and, well, they wanted to have a cake and eat it too, so to speak. This caused chaos in the primaries because candidates could be re-elected in the primaries by receiving the nominations of several political parties, even though their own beliefs didn't necessarily align with those parties. This weakened the political party system in California considerably for a number of decades. This cross-filing system, which really was quite strange. Now the topic goes to women's suffrage, and California certainly was on the forefront of that. In 1911, California became the sixth state to adopt women's suffrage for voting elections in the state, for elections in the state. Uh, it didn't pass by much. Of course, it had to be passed by an all-male electorate at the time, and it was approved by that all-male electorate by a margin of less than 2%. So it was a squeaker, but of course had manifold ramifications for California governance from that point on. Back prior to then, back in the 1870s, there was a San Francisco school teacher by the name of Sally Hart who successfully convinced the legislature in the 1870s to allow women to be elected to school boards. So there you have this interesting precedent of a part of the electorate, well, a part of the population who was not allowed to vote that could actually be elected to office. Of course, in 1911, they got the right to vote. Also in that decade, Laura DeForest Gordon and Clara Shortridge Foltz became the first women admitted to UC's Hastings School of Law. The picture you see is women participating in a suffrage parade in Oakland in 1908, which is a very poignant photograph as well. On the left, you see a picture of Laura DeForest Gordon. Above, to the right, a picture of Clara Shortridge Foltz. This is actually kind of interesting because Laura DeForest Gordon was married, and she and her husband, who had moved out from back east, actually ended up settling in Lodi. That's why the credit for the photo on the left of Laura DeForest Gordon goes to the Lodi News. So she practiced law in San Francisco Monday through Friday and came home to Lodi on weekends. This is back in the early 19 teens. Very interesting. And then, of course, you see Clara Shortridge Foltz. In the 1879 California Constitutional Convention, elaborating more on women's suffrage, an article was adopted with language written by Gordon and Foltz prohibiting anyone from being employed in any lawful business, vocation, or profession. I should say prohibiting anyone from being prevented from being employed. Boy, that's a big error on my part. My apologies there. Sometimes I do these things late at night and the language was not correct. That language allowed all people, regardless of gender, to be employed in any lawful business, vocation, or profession. Sorry about that error. This then enabled LaForce and Foltz to be admitted to the California bar. Another early leader of women's suffrage in California was Ellen Clark Sargent. She was the one that really was touted with being the one who organized the suffrage movement in California in 1869. On the California ballot in 1896, suffrage for women in California was initially defeated because many of the male voters thought that women's suffrage would bring prohibition because there were a lot of women's temperance leagues, of course, who wanted California to be a dry state, but they also wanted women to be able to vote. Catherine Phillips Edson of Los Angeles convinced the Lincoln Roosevelt League at their first meeting to endorse women's suffrage. This was around 1907, and it finally passed in 1911, as we alluded to earlier. Then there was the issue of public morals, and this again had to do with the consumption of alcohol more than anything else, also horse racing and the like, but mostly drinking. One factor in the success of women's suffrage in 1911, as opposed to its defeat in 1896, is that by this point in 1911, temperance was becoming more widely accepted as an important political reform by the progressives. Later on, you'll learn that there were dry progressives and there were wet progressives. That's how they kind of divided themselves up in politics at this time. In 1911, then, because of the women who are voting now, and also because of pressure by these women toward the legislature, both houses of the California legislature passed a local option law, which then permitted local areas at the option of their voters to ban saloons. In the next 5 years, more than half of the districts in the state voted to close their saloons. So I guess there were dry counties and wet counties at this time. Also in 1911, racetrack gambling was prohibited, but that prohibition was repealed 20 years later. Slot machines were banned in 1911. Of course, now we have them in Indian gaming casinos, but that's a different story because those are separate sovereign nations. Prostitution was banned in 1913. So there is a look at the first half of Chapter 21, Chapter 21A.